Hello, Fiendlings, how the hell are you? It's been nearly a decade since we had to break in a new dog, and the other two were better socialized than the derpy thing known as Violet. But she's beginning to settle into a familiar, if more energetic pattern. In short, she's going to make sure I get my exercise. Now, if only I can teach her how to fetch. Back in the world of writing, I'm still working on 2 books simultaneously and recording Neptune's Scars when my voice cooperates. Considering I'm turning that manuscript in the first week of June, I want to have a decent head start on the audiobook and podcast, so everything will be ready to go at the same time. That's the plan. Stick around to see how it changes. With that, I'm going to get these podcasts out and get some work done. Maybe kill a character or 2. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 14 of The Black.
20 roughnecks, 20 men of the morning shift. They had headed to the commissary for a meal, some trash talk and the usual camaraderie. Red was last to head up the stairs and was now at the door. After the physical with the doc, he'd wanted a shower. That man gave him the creeps. He'd winced as he'd pulled off his grease-covered shirt. He knew he'd damaged his rotator cuff and hoped it was only a sprain. When the quake had happened, he'd ended up tripping over the joint lines and falling on his side. And for that little mistake, his body was covered in bruises and his right arm screamed at him when he tried to lift it above his shoulder. Great fucking day, he thought. After struggling just to get his shirt on, his stomach had growled at him. He imagined Rodriguez was already dealing cards for the poker game. Nutty would have something good to eat, probably his frou-frou noodles and sweet sausage. Red had grinned at the thought, and then he opened the doors. The first thing to hit him was the smell. Burned meat, spoiled food, and something not quite discernible. His nostril hairs wilted beneath the stench. When he had a moment to recover from the eye-watering odor, his brain denied what he was seeing. The floor near the tables was covered in black ooze. Steel zippers, buttons, the occasional pocket knife, belt clasp, and earring sat atop the ocean of black. In one corner of the room, the steel toe of a boot shined beneath the commissary lights. "What the?" Red asked. The floor shivered. The substance rippled as the edges pulled back from the walls. It concentrated itself, and then something rose from the goo. As Red watched, a tentacle of black solidified and popped out of the muck. Another crackling sound and an eye stalk emerged. The nearly black orb stared at him. "Fuck," Red said. He turned to run. He turned to scream. He turned to leap down the steps, but something grabbed his foot. Caught in mid-jump, he fell to the stairwell landing with a crunch. His right shoulder was definitely broken now, but the lance of pain from his upper body was immediately drowned out by the screaming nerves in his foot. He twisted over so he could see what was burning his leg and shrieked as bones snapped. Smoke curled from the black ooze crawling up his pant leg, the heavy denim disintegrating beneath the substance. Howling in pain, Red used his hands to pull himself to the first step. A stream of tears fell from his eyes and blurred his vision. God, the pain! He pulled with his gnarled, strong fingers and dragged himself forward. There was another snap, and he knew, somehow knew, his left leg was gone at the knee. He heard the plodding of heavy boots on the staircase. Through his tears, he saw Harabin's balding head as the man headed toward the landing. "Help me!" Red screamed. Harabin lifted his eyes to the landing and froze. Color drained from his face and his mouth opened in a wide O. "Help me!" The mudlogger blinked at him, stumbled, and had to hold the railing as he fled down the steps 2 at a time. Red screamed again. Against every instinct he had, he looked back at his leg. Streams of ooze had wrapped around his thigh in a rising spiral. He could see bone and exposed muscle between the gaps. Red pulled as hard as he could, but his strength was going. His body shivered as he went into shock. He watched as the tendrils met. A gurgling sound filled his ears as the liquid rushed from the floor and swept up his other leg. The smell of burning hair and flesh made him vomit. Red's breathing became labored and his vision grew dim. The blanket of black slowly covered him as he lost consciousness. "Have you learned your lesson?" he asked himself. "Yes, never play the stock market again." Subkowiak headed down the hall to the staterooms. Gomez had demanded he check in on the 3 sick mud specialists. But what the deck chief didn't seem to understand was that Subkowiak had been trying to check on them for the past several hours. He'd been on his way to do just that when the rig quake happened. Instead of checking on them, he'd been forced to give the deck crew physicals. More delays. More time lost. Subkowiak sighed as he reached Richardson's room. Richardson was a balding Brit with a hawk nose and a congenial smile. When he'd come to dock a day after the first well had been drilled, he'd complained about coughing and rattling in his chest. Subkowiak had been alarmed at the man's 102-degree fever. He'd given him the usual fever suppressants and a Z-Pack. While Subkowiak didn't believe in handing out antibiotics like they were candy, Richardson had all the symptoms of pneumonia. The 2 other mutters, Jameson and Parker, had visited him later the same day with the same symptoms. He'd filed reports with PPE as soon as he'd sent the men back to their rooms armed with meds. SOP was to alert the company in the event of a dangerous illness spreading through the crew. PPE hadn't bothered to do more than acknowledge their receipt and send them the standard quarantine evac policies. Before ever stepping foot on Leaguer, he'd made sure he was familiar with them. He knew PPE sent the policies to him just to make sure he was aware of them, but it had been unnecessary. Subkowiak wanted to make sure he didn't end up dead because of some aerosolized VD the Roughnecks were likely to bring back from shore leave. The black leather bag in his hand seemed to weigh a ton. He'd had to keep changing his grip on the handles to keep the sweat from causing them to slide out of his grasp. The bag thumped to the floor and rattled. He donned a surgical mask, fiddled with the straps until it was comfortable, and then let his hands drop to his sides. The paper filter would keep him safe from all but the smallest microbes. Just a precaution, he told himself. He rapped on the door. There was no response. "Mr. Richardson, it's Dr. Subkowiak. Can I come in?" No response. Subkowiak rubbed his bald head. He didn't want to do it, but regulations were regulations. He reached into the pocket of his khakis and brought out a keyring. Only 2 people on the rig had a master key, the rig doctor and the rig chief. It was only supposed to be used in times of emergency, either medical or rig-related. He slotted it into the door lock, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The bolt slid back with an audible click. Doc returned it to his pocket and swung open the door. The well-oiled hinges were silent as the door opened inward. There were no lights on. The portholes were covered, and he stared into utter darkness. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the first few feet inside. "Mr. Richardson, are you in here?" The darkness in the corner of the room shifted. He listened for the telltale rattle of labored breathing, but there was nothing but the sound of the AC. "Andrew?" he asked the room. It didn't respond. "I'm going to turn on the lights, Mr. Richardson. I need to see how you're doing." At the touch of his fingers, strong fluorescent lights glared down on the room. Doc's eyes adjusted, and then he blinked as he took in the destruction. The bed was little more than a metal frame. The pillows were crusted with blood and shoved against the wall. In the center of the bed, the comforter, sheets, and mattress had dissolved into nothing. The remains of the fabric looked as though its edges had been burned by a flame. After a beat, he realized the hole in the bed was man-shaped. Something moved in his peripheral vision. Doc turned and stared at the far corner. Beneath the desk and covered in shadow, something rippled. "Richardson?" Doc's voice was a barely audible tremor. He stepped into the room, his leather bag forgotten. The ghostly scent of cooked flesh and spoiled meat wrinkled his nose. There was some other smell, something like metal, but he couldn't place it. He kept his eyes on the darkness beneath the desk until he reached the bed. His breath stopped as he peered down into the hole in the mattress. Metal glinted at him. Surgical steel, pins, and a plate. "What the fuck?" he asked the room. There was no reply. Richardson had broken his leg in a rugby match at university. The man's medical records had described the location of the plate and pins. And there they were, on the floor. He cast his eyes back to the desk and the shadow beneath it. The dark pool rippled again. "What the fuck are you?" "Richardson's dead, you old fool," a voice said in his mind. "Get out of here." Doc swallowed hard. He didn't want to check on the other men. He didn't want to be on the rig. He didn't want to be anywhere but back in Austin lancing boils and popping kids with vaccinations. He stepped backwards away from the bed, eyes firmly fixed on the desk and the thing beneath it. It had stopped moving. When he reached the doorway, he closed the door and didn't bother turning off the lights. Whatever was in there could stay in there. Forever. Taking deep breaths, he picked up his leather bag and headed down the hall. He needed to get back to his office. He had to call PPE. They needed an evac. They'd never believe what he saw, but he'd say the men were near death. That would get them a chopper, or a boat, anything to get off the rig. The drilling office was cool and dark. Catfish had turned off the lights so they could all bask in the glory of his monster movie. Vrabel was still trying to process what he'd seen. As he and Calhoun had made their way to the drilling office, the engineer had said he and Shauna had been attacked by the oil sample. Vrabel wanted to yell bullshit as loud as he could. The man had clearly gone insane. He'd considered ignoring Calhoun and simply heading back to the bridge. But then Calhoun had said the AUV had filmed what happened to the drill string. That was enough to keep Vrabel from bolting. The email from Simpson regarding the quarantine of the Houston lab, coupled with what Calhoun said, had set him on edge. When Catfish had shown him the film, yeah, that's when the wheels of reality started to come off. "The tube worms aren't tube worms," Vrabel finally said. Calhoun, Shauna, and Catfish were all staring at him and had been for several seconds. Calhoun cleared his throat. He rubbed his hands together. Vrabel was sure the man was going to tell him it was a joke, but the big engineer's face turned stony. "No, Vrabel, they're not." He sighed and jerked a thumb at the screen. "That's what grabbed the drill string. You could see it as clear as day." "No," Vrabel said. "Simply not possible." Shauna and Catfish exchanged a glance. A strange look came over her face, and when she met Vrabel's eyes, they glittered with something akin to madness. "If you don't believe us, I can always take you in the lab, give you a flashlight, and then turn off the overheads. Then maybe you'll understand." "Is that a threat?" Vrabel asked. His pulse pounded in his ears. None of this made any sense. Maybe in the Twilight Zone or some goddamn Jake Bible book, but this shit didn't belong in reality. Period. "You're threatening to lock me in your lab?" She shook her head. "You don't get it, do you?" She turned and pointed at the screen. "That happened, Vrabel. That is fucking real." Shauna was obviously close to panic. Whatever had happened, or she imagined happened, had addled her brain. There was no other explanation for a rational person, a scientist no less, to take this seriously. Vrabel tapped his foot and raised his hands. "I don't believe it. I simply do not accept this." Calhoun's face flushed. "Vrabel," he said in a low, even voice, "do you accept that the Houston lab has been quarantined?" "Of course," Vrabel said. "I mean, Simpson wouldn't fuck with us, would he?" Calhoun shook his head. "No, Simpson wouldn't. And I'm telling you that we're not fucking with you either. What would be the purpose?" He opened his mouth and then closed it. He didn't know what to say to that. What would be the purpose? Vrabel couldn't believe he was going to say the words that popped into his mind. "Say that I believe that," he said and pointed at the screen. "The hell am I supposed to do about it? What do you suggest? We pull the string back up?" Catfish shook his head. "We don't know how it would react." "It? You mean the drill string?" Vrabel asked. "Fuck," Catfish said in a raised voice. "No, goddammit, whatever that is beneath the goddamn ocean floor." "It," Vrabel said. He rubbed at his temples. A headache was definitely in his future. "I think we need to evacuate the rig. Right now. Let PPE decide what to do." Calhoun looked at Catfish. "Show him." The tech turned in his chair and brought up a web browser. A dialog box popped open. DNS failure. Network unavailable. "See that?" Catfish asked. "We no longer have an internet connection via the satellite." Vrabel blinked. Bullshit. Unless something's wrong with the antenna. There's nothing wrong with the antenna, Calhoun grimaced. If there was, GPS wouldn't be working. Okay, so it's just an outage. Sunspots or something. Calhoun slammed a hand down on the desk. Vrabel, you're in denial. And if you want to save your goddamn men and this rig, you need to snap out of it. They've isolated us. They shut us off from the network. And there's not going to be any evacuation. You don't know that, Vrabel yelled. You're just jumping to conclusions. You're scared, I get that. After watching that, he said, I'm a little shaken too, but PPE isn't just going to leave us out here. Shauna nodded. Yes, they will. If the CDC has already gotten involved in Houston and they know where the sample came from, they're going to assume we've all been exposed to the agent. What agent? Vrabel asked. You have no proof of anything that happened to anyone on this fucking rig. Calhoun walked away from the desk, hands clasped behind his back. The problem, he said to the monitors hanging from the ceiling, is we don't know what it does when it encounters a human being. We can find out, Catfish said. We need to go see JP. Right, Shauna said. She looked at Calhoun. Have you talked to him today? Calhoun shook his head. No. Catfish? Nope, I figured he was out with the dive crew. Vrabel pursed his lips. You think what? That he was bitten? Catfish shrugged. That's what he said, and JP's a tough bastard. He wouldn't hide in his bunk unless it was something pretty damn serious. Okay, Calhoun said. Let's go see JP. Maybe he knows something. Or at least we can find out if this shit is lethal. And if it is? Vrabel asked. Calhoun paused. He headed to the door. I'd rather not think about it. The world appeared to be made of shades of gray. Harriban had nearly fallen down the steps as he ran away from whatever the fuck that was in the commissary. When he reached the bottom steps, he just kept running until he was in his stateroom. Once he closed the door, locked it, and propped a chair beneath the door handle, he stood with his back against the wall, huffing and puffing. His lungs burned and his heart trip-hammered, but he was safe. He stood there until the stars floating before his eyes departed and the world returned to full color. His GP had told him he needed to lose weight. Harriban hoped he'd have a chance to get healthy. After he'd left the drilling office to take a shower and clean up, he'd realized he hadn't eaten lunch. That was when he went to the commissary. He wasn't sure he'd ever eat again. Red, he thought that's what the man's name was lying on the landing outside the commissary. The man's face was white as a sheet and trails of blood were trickling from his nose. When the man screamed for help, Harriban had been caught off guard. He hadn't even noticed him until then. And then, the black. A large puddle was consuming the guy. Even though he was still on the steps, he could see Red was missing the lower half of one leg. But that wasn't the terrible part. The terrible part was the appetizing scent of cooking meat and then realizing the source was the dissolving flesh of one of your coworkers. Harriban closed his eyes and willed himself not to puke. On top of the rig quake, this was too much. Just too goddamn much. He was a coward. He'd run. He'd said fuck you to Red by hightailing it down the steps to save his own skin. But what else was he supposed to do? If Red had seen what was behind him in the commissary, he'd understand. Shit, he'd probably have screamed at Harriban to get away. Yeah, that's how it would have gone down. The commissary floor was nothing but black oil and floating bits of metal, except for the thing sticking out of the mess. It had looked like a tentacle that ended in eyes. Harriban shivered as the image flashed through his mind. Fucking aliens have landed, he said to himself. Or maybe Shauna was right. Maybe there was something odd about the oil. Maybe it wasn't oil at all. Something banged in the hall and he froze. The ooze was in the hallway. It was going to slide under the door and... JP, open up! Harriban exhaled a deep breath, ears pounding with the sound of his heart. He peered through the peephole. Calhoun and Vrabel stood in front of the door across the hall. Harriban pulled the chair from beneath the door, unlocked it, and opened it. The two men turned toward him. Mr. Vrabel, he gasped, there's something you need to know. The rig chief's forehead furrowed as he squinted. Harriban? You look like shit. Why weren't you in the drilling office? Calhoun sniffed the air and grimaced. And what the hell have you been into? I saw... He took in a deep breath. I saw it. It ate Red. Vrabel glanced at Calhoun and then turned back to Harrowben. What are you talking about? The commissary, Harrowben said. It's in the commissary. Calhoun stepped forward so he was face to face with the geologist. What is it? The oil, he said. Or, I don't fucking know what it is. He tried to take another deep breath and realized he was panting. It took Red. It was eating him. Eating him? Vrabel asked. The hell you... Absorbing him. I don't know. It was crawling up his legs and he was screaming. Jesus, Vrabel said. Did you get him out of there? Harrowben shook his head. I ran. Harrowben started to cry. I couldn't save him. He was already gone. Calhoun placed his hands on Harrowben's slight shoulders. Harrowben, I need you to calm down. You're starting to hyperventilate. A sharp stabbing pain ran up his left arm. Harrowben's lungs froze, and suddenly there wasn't enough air in the world. His eyes grew wide, and drool fell from his mouth. The floor of the hallway rushed toward him, and he smashed into it, head first.